Hello. Oh, recording in progress. Okay, lovely. Hello, everyone. Sorry, my little icon is a little bit dark. It's really light outside. I've not got much shadow. I'm feeling very batty. I'm being all dark and mysterious. So yeah, any questions? Either pop them in the chat box, or there is. I'll be taking questions at the end. There's plenty of time for any questions that you have. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking all about bats. This is sort of a little outline of what we're going to cover today. We're looking at what exactly is a bat, the differences between the UK and Welsh species and where there's a bit of overlap. We're looking at profiles of the different species of bat that we've got that are a bit more common, that you're more likely to bump into when you're out and about. Looking at local conservation that's taking place to help our bats, as well as what you can do to get involved to help bats at home and at work and wherever you are, really. So I am part of North Ceredigion Bat Group. So that was started as an amateur enthusiast, but now I sort of am there as on my ecology side of things as well. The group has been established for quite a long time. So it was founded in 1992. And has always sort of been a mix of professionals and volunteers, because bat work is quite niche, and sometimes you need a license for it. It works well to have a mixture of professionals and volunteers as well, because we like to train people up, because that can help them both in their love of bats, but also in their career as well. Because one thing that we focus on as a bat group is the National Bat Monitoring Programme, and that is a survey that absolutely anybody can do. It's all about counting bats as they come out of their roost, and that's one of the surveys that we like to introduce people to, and I'll chat a little bit about that later in the talk. And so as a group, we tend to mainly stick on emergence counts and things like that, but sometimes we do other fun stuff as well. So this is a bit of harp trapping. Sadly, I wasn't part of the group when they did this. So that involves just putting up a net to catch bats and ring them, and sort of that helps us identify population recovery and where they're going in the area as well. And as a group, nowadays we do a lot of public engagement, so doing talks like this, and before COVID, and hopefully soon we'll be back out and again visiting people. Sometimes taking them bats that we have in care, because as well as being a bat enthusiast both out in the world, I do that, and I take in bats that need a little bit of care and love and attention, because quite often they just need somewhere to rest and recuperate and feed up, because it's a hard life being a bat when you rely on insects. We live in Britain and we have such changeable weather. I've had 2 bats in recently that didn't fare so well after the solid days of rain that we've been having. Although luckily yesterday, as we know, it was lovely and sunny, and so I was able to release one of my bats, and so that was lovely. Hopefully, if we've got time at the end, I'll be able to introduce you to Heathcliff, the common pipistrelle, who is currently in residue in one of my tanks just over there. So this is one of our other patients that we had. This is Gerald, the brown long-eared bat. So generally I deal with 3 species, the common and soprano pipistrelle and the brown long-eared as well. And we'll have a look more about those species in focus in the species profiles later on in the talk. And so what comes to mind when you think about the word bat? When you think about bat, what sort of images come to mind? Is it Halloween-based things? Are they spooky connotations in mind? Do you have film or media references in your brain? Do you think about Dracula and vampires and perhaps other bats from other countries? I know we see a lot of fruit bats in our David Attenborough programs and our natural history programs. So I guess it gets us thinking about what we actually know about bats in general, but also about the bats that live alongside us. So what exactly are bats? Well, they're mammals like us. So that means that they have warm blood, they have fur, and they feed their young on milk. And they have just 1 baby a year, and they put loads of time and investment into that baby. And so their reproductive strategy is very much like ours, in that they put a lot of time and investment into that baby, because they live quite a long time. So even though they're quite small bats, they can live up to about 30 years, so in some species. And so they are the only true flying mammals. So unlike gliding squirrels and things like that, that are only fakers, bats are true flying. So that means they can launch themselves into the air from the ground and sustain flight. And there are quite a lot of different species around the world, over 1,400 different species. And you can find them on every continent in the world except Antarctica, where it gets a little bit too chilly for them. They're quite a primitive body shape when it comes to mammalian evolution. And the oldest bat fossil that we found is from 52 million years ago, which means that body shape has existed in the diversity of creatures from at least that time period, which means it's clearly a very successful body shape, and being able to fly has clearly allowed bats to take advantage of a different niche in between ground mammals and flying birds. They can intersect that area and take advantage of the habitat and the food that's available there. And so because they're mammals and they are related to humans, they do have very similar morphology in a way. So bats, they are classified in the order Chiroptera. Hope I'm saying that correctly. And that is Greek, again, I think. It roughly translates to hand wing. And as you can see on this diagram here, if you were a bat, imagine having quite a short humerus and your radius and your ulna, a little bit sort of shortened in, and the majority of your hand being attached from skin to your neck all the way down to your feet. In between your feet, and your skin blanket would come all the way up your side, attached in between your fingers and up to your shoulders again. And so that's how bats manage to be so successful in their flight, because they are essentially wearing one big parachute suit. And that's, I suppose, where a lot of base jumpers get their inspiration from when it comes to being able to glide so successfully. Bats have really been able to master that. And they've been able to evolve lots of different strategies. So although their skeleton and their muscles are basically the same, a lot of their sort of external features, their fur and their facial features, have evolved to adapt to different niches that are available. So that's different areas in the habitat and the environment. And because we've got so many species of bat and they've been able to colonize all over the world, that means we've got a lot of variation in species. So for example, I love these little tent making bats from South America. So they like to utilize palm leaves, and what they do, they bite little holes in the veins of palm leaves to make them fold over to make a little tent to protect them from the rain in the rainforest, because as you can see, they're really, really furry, and I wouldn't want to get my fur all damp and wet. When it comes to facial adaptations, some bats have evolved to be able to take advantage of pollen sources. So the long-nosed bat has a really long snout and a really long tongue that enables it to sip out the pollen from tubular plants that have adapted themselves to become long and elongated in order to try and escape predators like the long-nosed bat. But these co-evolution sort of wars of strategies that different animals engage in to sort of try and get the better of each other. The plant doesn't necessarily want the long-nosed bat to get all of its nectar, but the long-nosed bat really wants it, and so they have to adapt sort of together. And another thing that we see in facial structures as well is these amazing skin flaps. And you might have heard the bats hunt using echolocation, using sound. And these skin flaps actually have a lot to do with that, and it sort of moves the sound around the face and directs the sound into the ear and allows the bat to translate lots of different sound information. So that's one of my favorite bats, because he's got such an awesome facial leaf there. So that's all made out of little skin lumps and flaps and things like that. Although we don't have anything that fancy in the UK. So quite a lot of bats, lots of different variety, that's lots of different feeding strategies as well. They're really important pollinators, because of course they visit different flowers. That long-nosed bat with his long feeding tube, that's just his nose, his long tongue, that helps plants reproduce in their reproductive cycle. And some plants rely on bats fully for their reproduction. the plant, the agave plant, again, I hope I'm saying that properly, relies completely on bats in order to reproduce and to pollinate their flowers. And this is the plant where we get tequila. So all of you tequila lovers out there, you also need to stand up for your bats if you're going to enjoy your tequila going forward, because they're incredibly important in their pollination cycle. As well as being pollinators, they're vital pest controllers. So all of our bats in the UK feed on insects. And of course, we've got insects, we've got midges, mosquitoes. Those are amazing and vital prey for our bats. So they do us a favor as well by keeping them at bay. And so our bats are split into two groups. So worldwide, we have the mega bats. So those are the really huge bats, the flying foxes that you get in Australia and Africa. And so this comprises of about one family and just under 200 species. But the majority of bats are classed as micro bats. And so these bats tend to be on the smaller side and by all means have a much higher diversity. And it just so happens that you can probably tell all of our bats in the UK are of course micro bats. We don't have any of those large boys out there in nature. I don't think our climate would sustain them. So those bats, those large fruit bats, of course, they feed on fruit rather than insects. So we've got 17 different species of bat in the UK. I say species, breeding species in the UK. And this is a list of all of them. Don't worry, I won't test them. I won't test you on them at the end, but you can find lists of these on the Bat Conservation Trust website, as well as profiles that go into the specifics of all different species. But because bats are quite an understudied animal, they haven't been really looked at in depth until quite recently. We're still sort of untying their genetics, and even the soprano pipistrelle and the common pipistrelle, they were only separated as species, I think it was in 1993. So before then we thought they were two species. So this could change at any time. We're always learning new things when it comes to looking at bats and looking at DNA. So in terms of our bats and sizes, this is a sort of comparison between our smallest bat and our largest bat. So the common pipistrelle, which is probably the one that people are most familiar with. These are the ones that you find hawking under street lights quite often. So they're quite small. They never get, their wingspan never reaches more than about 50 centimeters, and they weigh between about 3 to 7 grams. I've never come across a pip that's weighed more than 6 grams. I would think that would be a very hefty bat. I imagine a pregnant mum would probably get up to around the 7-gram mark. Whereas we have noctual bats, and so they are our biggest bats really. They can be often mistaken for things like swifts, as they fly quite high in the sky early in the evening. And they've got quite a large elongated wingspan, up to about 80 centimeters, and they weigh about 30 grams, which I suppose is quite hefty for something that has to propel itself in flight. So I remember me saying breeding species specifically, because we do have one lone male greater mouse-eared bat, or at least we did. So this bat used to overwinter in a tunnel, I think it is in Dorset or Kent, I can never remember. But it used to come back every year. And so these animals, you can find this species in France and on the continent. And it's thought that either he was blown over here from France and then just started making the journey, or he's a remnant of an existing population that might have existed here previously. We're not quite sure. Although he's not turned up in his cave for about 2 or 3 years now. So I think we're definitely just down to 17 species. But it's an interesting thing to think about as the climate changes, as Britain gets a little bit warmer, maybe, and the climate starts mimicking that of France and the continent, we might see species shift their ranges a bit further north. So you never know, in a couple of years' time, we might be seeing a few more records of natural migrations of these species, which is quite interesting, and that'll be lovely to see, because he's very, very cute, I must say. So of our 17 species in the UK, 12 of them are found in Wales. And at least this was last time I checked. There are species moving across the border all the time. But as far as I'm aware, these are the 12 species that you're most likely to find in Wales. So the species with the red boxes are the ones that you're most likely to come across just in your everyday life. These species are commonly associated with more human activity. So the pipistrelles don't mind roosting in modern houses and things like that. Noctuals you can often see in woodlands. Daubenton's, they like to roost in stony structures, so old stone barns and churches, and old stone bridges is another thing that they really like, because they are a water bat and they love to feed over rivers and streams and things like that. And brown long-eareds are another favorite of mine, and they like to have, they utilize big attic spaces because they like to have a lot of space to warm up before they go out to eat of an evening. So they require quite specific places to roost. Now we do also have the 2 horseshoe species in Wales, and we're really lucky to also have them in the county. So in Ceredigion we have both of these horseshoe species. Now they are quite rare because they're a different sort of family of bats when it comes to all the other bats. So the horseshoes are a Vespa bat, and so they're quite different in terms of their ecology and how they live, and so they require slightly different habitat requirements. They like to roost in caves and things like that, which I think is why Ceredigion makes such a good place for them. It's one of my projects this year is to try and find some greater horseshoes up in the Talabont mines on the Dovey, because we've had a few records near there, and I'm going to find them, I swear. Because now is the time of year when bats start to becoming active, because it's May finally, and although it's been incredibly wet, bats have still been active. So when they are hibernating throughout the winter months, it's very much related to temperature and weather conditions, but overall they tend to go into hibernation at around November. And their hibernation is essentially an energy conservation strategy. Everything slows down, their breathing, their metabolism. It means they don't need to spend so much energy throughout the winter, and as there's no real food available for them, and so they can survive a long time with very little needs. Like I said, this time of year, they are emerging from their hibernation, and their main goal is to put on weight. So after hibernation, after they spent that entire winter using up their fat stores, they are completely empty and they have nothing left. And so they need to feed up, find all those insects that they can to put on weight. And so that's why I've been finding quite a few bats. So my 2 bats in care have come to me because, not because they're injured or anything, but simply because they are found on the ground because they are purely exhausted. So I've had 2 bats that come under the 2 gram mark. So as you saw, pipistrelles go from 3 grams to 7 grams. So that's even smaller than the smallest pip. So they're going to need a bit of feeding up before they can be released. Because it's an important time of year. It's the time when babies get born. So bats are a very interesting animal. They employ a strategy called delayed implantation, which means that breeding happens in the autumn and mating happens in the autumn, and the female delays the development of the embryo essentially until the next spring when conditions are better. So mums at this time of year are sort of furthering their pregnancy, and their pups are born June and July. There are some reports of pups already being born in the south of the county, so in the south of the country, I should say. That means I should start getting prepared for baby bat calls as a bat carer. As a mammal, the young babies feed on milk, and the mum will carry her baby with her until it's about 3 weeks old. And this baby can be quite a lot of the mum's weight. And can you imagine trying to run around with a baby, you carrying your baby all the time if it was 30% of your weight? She's an epic mum. And the baby bats, they grow incredibly fast and they are independent at about 6 weeks. But they will follow their mum around as they learn quite a lot of their social skills and flying skills by following and copying their mums as they go out and about. Because the majority of bats are social species, not as in they sort of communal species. They like to roost together. Here's a lovely picture of a roost of brown long-eared bats. I think they're very cute, all smushed together. because the majority of our bats are crevice bats. So they actually like to huddle together in a crevice as opposed to dangling. The only bats in this country that dangle are the horseshoe bats. So that's how you know you've got a very interesting bat, is if it dangles. And so where do bats roost? Well, like I said, they roost pretty much anywhere. We have a lovely mixture of different ages of buildings and trees and things in this country. So bats can utilize quite a lot of different features in order to roost. Unfortunately, quite a lot of their natural features, so veteran trees and old barns and churches, are sometimes disturbed by, unfortunately, humans. And so all bat roosts are protected under law. And so that means for any species of bat, it's illegal to disturb the roost. And so that even means sort of hanging around near it, unfortunately. So that means that if you have a roost, it's important to maybe read up on advice on how to manage it going forward. And it's very, very easy. I would love to have a bat roost in my house. Like I said, you're able to count them for National Bat Monitoring Programme that helps conservation as well. Because in the UK, a lot of the populations of pretty much every bat species has declined due to a variety of factors, mostly loss of roosting sites. But the decimation of our natural habitats as well has had a knock-on effect, because obviously that means there's a lot less insect prey for bats to utilize. And because bats feed on insects, they have to then compete with birds then for the remaining insects, and that sadly doesn't seem to be faring very well, as their numbers unfortunately do in many places continue to decline. Because bats at the end of the day are insect eaters, and they eat a range of things, obviously, because we've got different shapes of bats and different sizes. They eat anything from tiny, tiny midges up to cockchafers and other larger beetles. They're a very, very fast metabolizing animal. They're very small. They live a fast life. A little pipistrelle bat can eat over 3,000 midges in one night. Brown long-eared bats tend to favor yellow underwing moths. I find quite a lot of these. This is what I'd like to think is a classic sign of that you've got brown long-eared bats around. It's finding the sort of the discarded parts of these yellow underwing moths, or the wing cases that the bat doesn't want to eat. And so noctual bats are larger bats. They're the ones that enjoy the cockchafers, the maybugs, and larger things like that. And so because they're different animals, different prey, looking for different things, they utilize different habitats and different parts of the habitat. So brown long-eareds, they're tree bats. They like to jump on their prey. So they use leaves in order to bounce their echolocation off in order to find their prey. Noctuals like to fly free, and they'll often fly high up above your head, high up, like I said, and so are often mistaken for things like swallows. Daubenton's will fly over lakes and rivers because they like to hawk for prey, again, like swallows do. And pipistrelles, again, are those little tiny little bats that are up for eating pretty much anything, and they don't tend to really mind humans so much in terms of light, and so pipistrelles will feed under street lights. Although brown long-eareds and those horseshoe bats, they tend not to like lights at all, and so they will actively avoid areas where there's too much light. And here's a lovely picture that I found on the internet somewhere that I thought really emphasized the importance of thinking about where you put your light and how it might affect bats. So as you see, we've got two big lights here over a bridge, over a river here. And you're thinking about what sort of bats are going to be utilizing this area and where are they going to go. So if we look at the lighting here, we're also thinking about, again, where our bats are going. So we've got a large line at the top, and so this will be our high-flying species like the brown long-eareds and the noctuals. Got our midline for our pipistrelles, and down here we'll have the Daubenton's. Although because we have such an impact light feature, some of those species won't want to then use this area. And so because of that light, we will end up losing species like the Daubenton's that would be roosting under the bridge here. And we'll also end up losing more tree dwelling species like the brown long-eared and the noctuals as well. And so by putting lights in slightly inappropriate places, you can end up impacting multiple species at one time. And so that's why it's really, really important to mitigate these sorts of things and think about human impact wherever we are, really. Because bats are incredibly special, and because they fly, well, not because they fly at night, that's sort of more a sort of savior strategy to avoid being predated. But they're one of our few mammals that utilize echolocation as a form of hunting. And so the calls that they use are a form of ultrasound, which means the majority of people cannot hear the majority of bats. I'd like to say that I'm quite lucky in that I can hear some of the clicks and chops, although I'd like to get quite a lot of people into an enclosed space with a flying bat, because I think quite a lot more people would be able to hear them if there wasn't a lot of background noise. And so bats like to utilize these calls, this ultrasound. So that means when they send out a call, and these sound waves send out into the environment, and then will reverberate off of objects that are in the bat's way. So objects such as trees and walls, and then prey. And all of these different items have different sound qualities, and the bat is able to make decisions in milliseconds as to what object is where. And they're able to hone in on insects, microscopic insects in the wider environment as they fly. And this is a fantastic clip of a soprano pipistrelle feeding on a midge. And so the midge is highlighted there with the white arrow. And so this is slowed down footage of a pipistrelle hawking in to find this midge, and then sort of cupping it up with its tail and its hind feet. Some of my favorite clips. So all this time, the bat will be calling out until it finds that midge and is able to capture it. So if you want to see any more of these videos, Ian Baker is he's got quite a lot on his Vimeo channel, which I can link you all to. So echolocation is a form of using high frequency sound calls and sound waves to locate prey and to navigate your environment. So they say that bats are blind, and they're not actually that blind. They can see things, but using echolocation is their preferred form of location. So they echolocate at different frequencies. So the soundscape can get a bit busy if all the bats are shouting all at once. And so bigger bats tend to echolocate lower down the spectrum, so about 20 kilohertz, things like noctuals. Then you have your mid-species bats, things like soprano pipistrelles tend to go at about 55 kilohertz, and the horseshoe bats tend to hover at around 100. And because we can't hear them with our human ears, we have to use things like bat detectors. And so this is a form of heterodyne bat detector. And what that does, that essentially just brings the sound down to our level. It sort of modifies the sound so that we can hear it. And now, because there's been lots of different increases in technology, you can have your standard heterodyne bat detector that can cost you about £60. These are the magenta range. That picture is the magenta 5, and I've got the magenta 4 here. And so they've got I haven't got very good light here. So they have a dial that you can move to select your frequency, and can obviously pop your headphones in, and that's literally it. And you just listen to the bat chittering away. And I've got a couple of clips to show you in a minute. And if you're feeling fancy and want to go high tech, you now can have things that will automatically scan bats for you. So this tiny little device is the Echometer, and you pop that into your smartphone or your tablet, and it can record bats for you. And not just that, it can show you the sonogram as well. So that's the sort of visual representation of the sound. And so that's another way that you can identify species, as well as looking at the call signature, how it looks. So I promised you some bat calls, so here we go. Please pipe up if you can't hear it very well, because I will move my microphone. But the clips are quite short, so I'll play them a few times. And so this is how the calls sound to us through these detectors. The pace, should I say, is the same, but the sound is different. So it sounds lower than it would actually be in real life. But this is what it would sound coming through a detector for a common pipistrelle. So these guys tend to go quite fast. Whoops, that's not what I was meant to do at all. I hope you can all hear that. Please say if you can't hear that. Lovely. Play it again for you. They've got quite slippy, slappy, chippy, choppy sounds, quite fast. And so their cousin, the soprano pipistrelle, they call it 55 kilohertz because it's higher, because they are a soprano pipistrelle. So these are the two that weren't separated until about 1993, because their calls are very, very similar and they look very, very similar too. It's very, very fast. So in there are little sort of sounds that sound like a tiny zip being pulled. Now that is what we call a feeding buzz. Like in the video clip that I showed you, that is when a bat hones in on a prey item, and as they get closer and closer and closer, their calls get faster and faster and faster in order to be able to accurately navigate where the prey is. And that's what we can hear when we hear the little zip noise, is the soprano pip honing in on the prey. I'll just play that again for you. I hope you can hear the little zip, zip there. And so common and soprano pips, they are our smallest bats, and they are the most common in the UK. And they look very, very similar and sound very similar, which is obviously why we didn't really realize they were two different species until we looked at their genetics. And they roost in very large numbers, so sometimes in their hundreds. I know one roost that we monitor down in the Rydal had about 300 bats in it one year. And they tend to roost in more modern structures. They tend to be a bit less fussy than some of the other bats. So we move on to our noctuals. So these guys are our biggest bats. So they call down at 20 kilohertz. And so some people can hear these with their just regular ears, and it just sounds very, very like high-pitched squeaking if you can hear it normally. But this is what it sounds like coming through a bat detector. Play that again. So as you can hear, it's a lot slower than the pipistrelle. It's a lot more deliberate, flip, flop, flip, flop, flip, flop, as opposed to chittering and chattering. And so that's another way that you can distinguish between the species, is not just where they're calling in terms of the frequency, but also in terms of the kilohertz, but also the rate of the calls as well. And so noctuals, they are, like I said, the biggest bat species in the UK. And they like to eat large beetles and moths, and they really like woodland habitats. And so they thrive in old rot holes and old woodpecker holes like this one here. And you can tell that a noctual or other bats are residents because they leave these staining holes here. So that's a lovely line of wee that the bat has left there. So they like to sort of hang out in the hole here before they leave the roost, and casually deposit as they leave the roost, and ends up with this staining mark down there. So moving on to our Daubenton's. Now they're in the family of Myotis bats. Now, the Myotis bats, which include the Daubenton's and NATUR's, whiskered and Brandt's species, they all look very similar and they all sound very similar. So even professional ecologists, if you were out on a bat survey and you hear a Myotis bat, you wouldn't be able to determine a species. You'd have to go and take your bat call and look at the sonogram, the visual representation of the call, in order to figure out who it is. Although with Daubenton's, they are the most visually striking of the Myotis bats. You can just about see in this picture, they have a dark top and a really light white tummy. And they're also a very hairy footed bat, and that helps them scoop up their prey from the water surface. So they are the water bat in the UK. They've got quite a high pitched speckly call. See here, let's play it. Here we go. This one's quite quick, so I'll play it a couple of times. It's very similar to pipistrelle in that it's very, very fluttery, but doesn't sound the same decisiveness as the pipistrelle. I know if you're a first time hearing this, it probably sounds all the same, but there are slight little differences between the different species call that you can pick out with a lot of practice. So like I said, Daubenton's are water bat, feeds over with rivers, streams, and other water bodies like lakes and reservoirs. They roost in old stonework, caves, mines, churches, and things like that. So moving on to our horseshoe species. So like I said before, these are a completely different sort of bat to all of our other bats. And as a result, they sound completely different. So you're probably thinking, they've got a very funny face. And yes, you're very right, because they have a horseshoe nose leaf. So these, this is one of the skin facial structures that a lot of our more tropical bat species use. But these species in the UK, we have our lovely horseshoe shape, greater and lesser horseshoe species. So they're the only two that we have in the UK. There are a couple more on the European continent, but yes, only two in the UK, greater and lesser, which makes things easier for us. So greater horseshoe is calls at about 80 kilohertz, 83 kilohertz. And like I said, it sounds completely different to all of the other bat species, completely different. Oh, very loud. Sorry if I deafened you there with that, apologies. So it does sound completely different. It's just a completely different way of making noise. So I'll go for it again, just as a warning. So I think it always sounds like aliens or alien spaceships or something like that. And the lesser horseshoe calls slightly higher frequency, but again, sounds very, very similar. I absolutely love that noise. So greater and lesser horseshoe, like I said, they've got the nose leaf. They are the only two species of horseshoe in the UK, and they do dangle, and they like using tunnels and railways, old mines for hibernation. This is a picture I took of some lesser horseshoes in an old church in Pembrokeshire. And so what we do as a bat group, our national bat monitoring program, very simple bat count, where we just count the bats as they come out, time the sunset, time our total watch, which generally takes about an hour, and look at the weather. So we've got 4 sites that we look at across Ceredigion. Our sort of, I suppose, our most interesting one, as you would say, is down at Furness in Eglwysfach. So that's right near Ynys here, and this is our lesser horseshoe bat roost. And so we've been monitoring this roost for quite a while now. Lesser horseshoes are one of our most endangered bat species. This is just a little sort of fact file about them. So they're about the size of a little plum. And so they're quite small. I'll just play their call again for you, their little alien call. If you want to, in the summer with your bat detector, if you want to go down to Furness and stand by the waterfall with your bat detector, if you're lucky enough, you might hear that sound. So we've been monitoring that roost for a while, and we found that the bats tend to even out between 30 in the mid to high 30s. Although in 2019, we were lucky enough to find a greater horseshoe, which is one of the things that sort of spurred me on to try and find more records in the area. And so one of the bat roosts, luckily, just lives up the road from me in a residential area that luckily has an old attic, because this is the brown long-eared bat, and they like big spaces in order to warm up before they go out of an evening. So they like old barns, and old farms are a great place to find these species. So we call them the whispering bat. And they sound very, very whispery, I suppose. So that's it, all of that tiny little, that's why they're called the whispering bat. I'll play that again. Yes, so they're quite difficult to even pick up on a detector if you don't have a fancy one that doesn't auto detect them. But they call it about 40 kilohertz, and yeah, they're a fantastic little bat. I think definitely one of the cutest looking bats that we have in the UK. So we've been monitoring that roost for over 10 years now, and our mean count is about 36. So it tends to go up and down. So we just think it's a regular roost as opposed to a maternity roost or anything like that. And so that the National Bat Monitoring Programme is always something that I would promote to anybody that is interested in getting involved in counting their bats. If you're lucky enough to have a bat roost in your house or on your land somewhere, then National Bat Monitoring Programme is such an easy thing that you can do to both increase our knowledge of bats, but also increase our knowledge and awareness of the distribution of bats and how they're faring across the UK. So this is us on one of our walks in Pen Parkeye, and so as a group we like to take people out and about to listen to bats and to get themselves familiarized with bat detectors and how they work. And we also like to chat to people about what they can do to help bats, because there are lots of really simple things that you can do to help bats in your garden or where you're living. The most important thing is to let your garden go wild, or if you haven't got a garden, even to plant some moth-friendly plant species maybe in a window box, because it's not just about the bats themselves, it's about the insects that they eat as well. Putting up a bat box is something that you can do if you're not able to install bat bricks or anything at your house. A simple wooden Kent bat box like that is something that you can easily make yourself. Similarly with ponds, that's another habitat feature that promotes the sorts of insects that bats eat. Keeping cats indoors is something that I would really, really suggest throughout the months of July and August, when young bats are around and quite often fall to the floor or are easily disturbed. And like I said before, take part in National Bat Monitoring Programme if you do have a roost. It's something that's incredibly easy, and you don't even have to have a bat detector. It's all just about counting bats as they come out. And the Bat Conservation Trust has so much information about what you can do for bats and how to get more involved in their conservation. So if you go to www.bats.org.uk, or if you just type Bat Conservation Trust into your search engine, loads of information on their website about bats and how to live with them, but then also how to welcome them into your garden and into your home. Like I said before, lots of resources on their website. They have a sound library, and where you can listen to lots of different calls. so you can try and figure out which bat that you've got, photo library of lots of different species, and then guidance for both professionals if you're thinking about doing some building works on your house, but then also some educational resources and some fun things for the kids as well. And if you do work with school groups as well, the Bat Conservation Trust is more than happy to send out free resources if you're doing an event or anything like that bat related. Now, when it comes to spending a few pennies, if you do want to perhaps invest in your bat knowledge, I would 100% recommend the FSC Field Guide. So this is about £3, £3.50, depending on where you get it from. And it lists all 17 of our species with a handy flow chart of their physical features. But then on the back, it has a lovely chart that lists their call frequency, their flight chart, their flight path, their habitat type, their visual, their call sonogram. I think for £3, it's an amazing resource. If you're wanting to get a little bit more into bats, then the Bats of Britain and Europe is a lovely sort of big volume on all of the bat species that you can find in Britain and Europe, because we've got 17 species in the UK, but there are a lot more on the continent. And of course, if you want just any intermediate and free information about bats, then the Bat Conservation Trust website is for you. And of course, if you're living in Ceredigion, especially in North Ceredigion, why not join us? We are on social media, and now that restrictions are lifting, we are starting to begin our summer program of walks, talks, and doing bat counts. So if you're thinking that maybe National Bat Monitoring Programme might be for you, but you don't know what bats you have on your property, then just get in touch, give us an email or pop us a message on Facebook. And then hopefully if we've got time, we can pop over and help you out with that. But yeah, definitely join us on Facebook, and I'll be posting all of the links from today's talk on there, as well as I'll pop them in the chat as well. So thank you very much for listening. If you do have any questions, I'm all ears.